Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Beaches East York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to let you know, I will be splitting my time with the member from Parkdale High Park, and I hope that we can return this debate to some serious footing. It's been punctuated by a Liberal stand-up routine and gratuitous political advertising this afternoon. But it's a very important issue, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to rise today in support of the motion before us, calling on us, as it does, to recognize a housing crunch of rising costs and growing waiting lists across this country owing to chronic underfunding of affordable housing. I want to thank my colleagues, the Member of Parliament for York South Weston and the Member for Hochelaga, for their work on this file and for bringing forward this motion for debate in the House today, Mr. Speaker. I don't know of any better way to establish the importance of housing than with reference to its almost universal, and I would accept the Liberals and Conservatives from this, of course, the almost universal recognition of housing as a human right. And I don't know of any better way to stir our collective desire to address our shortcomings on this issue than with reference to a history in which we proved ourselves as Canadians capable of doing so much more than this government and its predecessor Liberal government are and were prepared to do. Canada had, Mr. Speaker, up until a couple of decades ago, a very proud story to tell about housing. One way to start into this story, Mr. Speaker, is with reference to John Humphrey, something of a Canadian hero. John Humphrey was responsible for the first draft of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And in that declaration, one can find at Article 25 reference to housing. It reads in part, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control." End quote. That reference to housing finds its way, Mr. Speaker, 3 decades later into the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Article 11 recognizes, and I quote, "the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions," and so on, Mr. Speaker. But if we fast forward to 2009, we have a UN Special Rapporteur lamenting our more recent history. He says this about Canada, and I quote, "There has been a significant erosion of housing rights over the past 2 decades. Canada's successful social housing program, which created more than 500,000 homes starting in 1973, has been discontinued," end quote. And here's the more recent and inglorious history that he's referring to in this quote, Mr. Speaker. The last budget of the Mulroney Conservatives eliminated all federal funding for new social housing and froze spending on existing social housing. It was a move that cut housing investment by $660 million over 4 years. The Liberal Party campaigned on a promise to reverse those cuts. Of course, they never did. In fact, only 2 years later, they slashed a further $128 million from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation's budget, most of which was at the time allocated to affordable housing programs. And a year after that, in their 1996 budget, the Liberals walked away entirely from housing, downloading responsibility to provinces and territories. At the same time, it is worth noting, slashing transfers to those very same provinces and territories. This, Mr. Speaker, is how Canada ends up with an ignominious distinction of being the only major industrialized country to not have a national housing strategy. Just last year, this Conservative government announced that it would not be renewing the long-term operating agreements that began in the 1970s that the UN Rapporteur hailed in his 2009 report. Those agreements provide about $1.7 billion worth of housing subsidies to over 600,000 households in Canada. As that $1.7 billion dries up, mainly over the next few years, Mr. Speaker, it is anticipated that as many as 200,000 housing units will be lost due to the loss of operating funds or insufficient capital for much needed renovations. Now, this may be considered as a heretical notion to both Liberals and Conservatives in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, but there are simply circumstances in which markets don't work, when they simply don't emerge to meet demand, and so it is in housing. According to the National Household Survey, about 1/3 of households in Toronto spend more than 30% of their income on housing. That is, by the standard definition of affordability, they cannot afford to live in their own homes. Taking into consideration just renters, Mr. Speaker, that number rises dramatically. About 45% of renters in Toronto can't afford their own home. While this definition of affordability is a very useful standard to use, Mr. Speaker, it's important to note that nothing magic happens at that threshold. As pointed out in a very recent study, March 2014, by Paradis, Wilson, and Logan out of the City Centre of the University of Toronto, there's a continuum of inadequate housing, risk of homelessness, and visible homelessness among families living in Toronto's high-rise buildings. Housing is precarious for low-income families in Toronto's high-rises, and it is easy enough to slide up, but mainly down that continuum. Says the study, and I quote, "Inadequate housing and the risk of homelessness are almost universal among families with children living in high-rise rental apartments. Almost 90% face major housing problems that may place them at risk of homelessness. One family in 3 is facing severe or critical risk of homelessness," end quote. Part of the problem here, Mr. Speaker, is that there has been virtually no growth in new purpose-built rental housing in Toronto since 2006, according to Toronto's Vital Signs Report 2013. Just 1,800 units across the entire GTA, and only 810 in the city of Toronto itself. This, Mr. Speaker, in a city that welcomes 100,000 new residents every year. This is how we end up in Toronto with about 90,000 households on the waiting list for affordable housing. That unto itself is equivalent to the population of a large Canadian city, about the same size as Saskatoon or Regina, Mr. Speaker. And with less than 4,000 households from that list being housed every year, that list is growing. And with only 650 new units of affordable housing presently under construction in Toronto, we have today what is quite rightly called in the motion a housing crisis. Mr. Speaker, I framed this issue with reference back to Canadian John Humphrey and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a matter of human rights. Health, happiness, security, and the opportunity for everyone to realize their potential through education, they all turn on housing, safe, healthy, affordable housing, Mr. Speaker. This is a truth that we have turned away from as a country through successive federal governments over 2 decades, but it is a truth that exists nonetheless. But let me take the last couple of minutes, Mr. Speaker. Do I have a couple of minutes? I have 1.5, okay, of my time to talk about the economics of housing. This motion stands on more than just an ethical footing. It's good economics, too. And to understand that, we need look no farther than the Conservatives' own budget documentation. And I refer specifically to the data produced by the Department of Finance in support of the government's own economic action plan. That data points to the very efficient stimulus or multiplier effect of housing investment, showing that for every dollar, thank you, Mr. Speaker, invested in housing measures, $1.50 of economic activity is created. Interestingly, that compares very favorably to the stimulus measures that this government prefers. Personal income tax measures have a multiplier of just $1 over the same time frame, while business tax measures work very poorly, adding just 30 cents to the economy for every public dollar expended or foregone. Let me finish, Mr. Speaker, with a salute to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the work that they've been doing to bring this housing crisis into the public realm and to the attention of all Canadians. In their press release yesterday, they said, quote, FCM supports the NDP's continued focus on fixing Canada's housing crunch. The lack of adequate and affordable housing is one of the biggest issues facing Canadians across the country and is a threat to the social and economic growth of Canadian municipalities. End quote. No finer an endorsement, Mr. Speaker, so I'll close there and welcome any questions. Thank you.
Questions and comments, Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his comments. I think the outset it's going to be obvious that I don't agree with much of what the member said. So as opposed to going down that vein, I just wanted to really ask for his comments and his thoughts on what we heard from the Liberal Party on this. I know the Liberal Party mentioned their candidate in Trinity Spadina, somebody who was extraordinarily critical when he was a reporter of the billions of dollars in health and social transfer cuts that the Liberals unilaterally made, Mr. Speaker. He was very, very, very critical of that. The Liberal candidate in Trinity Spadina was also very critical of the Liberal government in Ontario that cut gas plants and wasted billions of dollars Mr. Speaker, on gas plants and all kinds of other things to the detriment of all kinds of other social programs, Mr. Speaker. But moreover, I want to also just catch on something that the Liberal member talked about. They had 3 majority governments, 1 minority governments. They were in power for 13 years and admit that they did absolutely nothing on this file. Does the honourable member, despite the fact that we disagree, does the honourable member think that Canadians can in any way trust the Liberals to actually live up to any commitments that they make in this House? Or does he believe, like I do, that what they're saying, the words that they say in this House, never match what they do?
The Honourable Member for Beaches East York.
Well, thank you very much to the member for his question. I'm not particularly interested in engaging in what the Liberals want to do in this House today with our time, and that's put up political advertising for their candidate in Trinity Spadina. I'm more interested, Mr. Speaker, in why the member doesn't agree with anything I've said. I've laid out the economics. The economics are supported by the government's own budget documentation. There are some irrefutable facts before this House, Mr. Speaker, that over the next decade, the need for purpose-built rental accommodation is going to exceed 50,000 units per year, and we've been averaging 15 to 20,000 units per year, Mr. Speaker. This is a crisis, and I don't know exactly how this government can turn a blind eye to it. He's quite right to point out that the Liberal government killed the National Housing Program in the 1990s, but I think it's true also, Mr. Speaker, and this member needs to face up to it, that they've been nailing close the coffin on that housing program for the last 8 years that they've been in government as well. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Markham Unionville.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to begin my question with a quote from the Globe and Mail in the summer of 2001. And the quote is, "I'm quite encouraged," said FCM President Jack Layton. "Tomorrow's meeting is the most important meeting in the history of housing policy in Canada since the creation of the CMHC. And what we're seeing here is a welcoming of federal funding back into housing." End of quote. Well, if Jack Layton was quite encouraged, in quotes, by these Liberals' plans back in 2001, why does this honourable member say these plans didn't even exist?
Good question. The Honourable Member for Beaches East York.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as much respect as I have for Jack Layton, and I have enormous respect for Jack Layton, we all get fooled more than once in our lives. And he may have been encouraged, but I know Jack Layton, and Jack Layton was extremely disappointed in what the Liberals ended up doing in housing. And in fact, it was Jack Layton who had to put an end to, or try to put an end to Paul Martin's corporate tax giveaways, which I've already talked about have a very low economic stimulus, but that didn't matter to the great austerity economist, Mr. Paul Martin. And extract money to put back into housing. $1.6 billion, Mr. Speaker, is part of Jack Layton's legacy in this country, going into affordable housing in this country when the Liberals wanted to give all of that away to big corporations in Canada. Thank you.
Resuming debate.